Hi, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be redesigning not only Jackson Jekyll, but also Holt Hyde from Generation 1 of Monster High. So starting off with Jackson here, I'm just sketching out his base body to do my redesigning on top of. I've always imagined him as being sort of short and chubby and having a rounded body type. As for my inspiration here, I did end up going with yellow, red, and orange as his main color scheme, and blue, green, and purple as Holt's simply by coincidence, because as it turns out, a lot of the early promotional material from some of the early movie posters had Jekyll in yellow and Hyde in green, so I suspect that is where Generation 1 got their idea for it as well. And so I just ended up having my design be the same color palette, because usually I try to go into these blind as if I've never seen the Monster High versions and just act as if I've given the prompt, design a character based on this character. So starting off with my first design here, I'm going for a very mad scientist look with a slicked back but slightly disheveled hair, bow tie, and a tied-up lab coat. For the second one, I wanted to do something a bit more formal with the cloak and the top hat to bring the classic Jekyll and Hyde silhouette. But for the third, I started latching onto this idea of the story of Jekyll and Hyde is that Jekyll feels the need to separate Hyde from himself because he feels like the only way to be pure is to act on his negative urges and impulses, but he doesn't want to be associated with that, and so he creates this completely separate being from himself who is him to act out those desires without inhibition. So I started having the idea to visually represent the idea of someone who is very much trying to hide a part of himself away and very repressed through the usage of baggy clothes, lots of layers, covering up as much skin as possible. So that's what I'm doing with these designs here. For the third one, I wanted to do a more sort of modern look, where I have a baggy turtleneck and a trench coat. And then for the fourth one, I want to do something that was a bit more relaxed, a little less formal looking. And for the fifth one, I wanted to start playing with some really sharp angles to sort of offset the curves of his body type, so that way it has some fun sort of visual play between soft lines and sharp lines. So here now, I have all these little base redesigns done. I'm writing out my favorite parts from each, and I'm just going to take what I like best from each redesign and turn it all into one. So starting off, I gave him some hair that covers one of his eyes, glasses, not only because it's a good way to have a character automatically read as stuffy and nerdy, but also because it hides his eyes as well. Then I'm adding a top hat on top of that because it is easily one of the most iconic parts of Jekyll's silhouette in my opinion. Then I have a little face mask on top of that. I also have him wearing gloves, so he is showing as little of himself as possible. For the trench coat, I wanted to again play with those nice sharp angles, so I have a really dramatic lapel. I also imagined the materials of his clothes being made of really dense, heavy fabrics, so a thick felt trench coat and a knitted woolen turtleneck, again to really play into that idea. As for layering, I wanted to do as much layers as possible, so on top of all of the accessories covering things, I have a full pair of pants, boots, and then trench coat, waistcoat, turtleneck, and scarf tied into a bow tie. So I had quite a lot going on here in terms of layers. This redesign process took me 51 minutes, which is almost double what it usually takes me, because I was just really not satisfied with where I was getting. I felt like none of the ideas were really gelling together cohesively into what I wanted them to be. For the color palette, I'm sticking with the yellow, orange, red outlines shown in the early posters, but I'm also adding some pops of green to just help break up the color palette a little bit and have it not look so Halloween-y. Instead of using pure blacks, I'm using more sort of a dark brown. An inspiration of mine in terms of the color palette was definitely, weirdly enough, very 70s inspired. I just felt like it sort of suited him, a lot of those muted mustards and brown combinations. Here, I'm just adding some little white streaks into his hair because I imagine he is someone who, because of his repression, is incredibly stressed all the time and his hairs are going gray at 15. So I'm just playing around here with the colors a bit more, trying to really refine that color palette and get it somewhere that I like. Because I struggled with this redesign. I was not super happy with it by the end of it, which we're coming up at where I'm about done with it. And here I'm just sort of blocking out the colors on his face to see how that would look. But I did end up between this little screen capture redesign and when I was physically drawing and laying it on a piece of traditional paper, since that is how I do my art, I was not really happy, and it ended up simplifying his design quite a bit, which you will see in just a moment here. So here is the final line art for his redesign, starting out with the small amount of skin tone that is there. I have the saturation turned very high up, but truly it is just so that it balances out with the rest of the vibrant color palette that he has. So here I'm just adding these white streaks, and you might notice that at this point in time I had already done the flats for Holt, and I'm copying what I did there. I just felt like doing his flats first instead of doing it in one after the other. So here I'm doing some sort of outlining on their bags, because in, I think, the 1940s adaptation of the movie, that was one of the design choices made for Hyde, was to have him look, one, very Neanderthal-esque, to have him represent those sort of baseline primitive urges, which I did end up later on trying to recreate a bit in my Holt Redesign and incorporate those elements, but it was also having the idea of one of his eyes, or at least one of the shots, it looks like one of his eyes, but it's really, I think, both of them, where he has these sort of dramatic, deep wrinkles in his face. So I wanted to do that with Jekyll too. And I definitely feel like it would also be somewhat subtle, because that's the eye that he covers. It's also the eye that he has pierced, because I want to keep that in. But it also somewhat matches the other eye, because he naturally has very big bags, because I imagine he's very stressed out all the time. As for the pose, I wanted it to be a little bit more dynamic than what I had originally sketched out. That was another big change that made a difference, or like a small change that made a difference, really. Is that I had sketched out the original redesign in full, in the original pose that I drew, and I just was not happy with it, so I decided to just scrap it and start completely from scratch again. So I have him pulling down that little face mask here so you can see the rest of his face, like he's talking or correcting somebody, because I felt like having his face covered is good character-wise, but visually it was a bit busy having that checkered space there, so I have him pulling it down so it's still incorporated as an accessory, but it's not taking up as much visual space. So here I'm just adding these little hints of green throughout his palette to call back to Holt and to just add some vibrancy into his otherwise very yellowy, honey-colored palette. Another change that I made is I axed the waistcoat entirely and just sort of incorporated that forked design into the trench coat itself instead. Have little elbow pads on the elbows of the trench coat and noise-canceling headphones, which were in the original design, but since I cleared things up a little bit and simplified, I feel like they stand out a little bit more now. As for his pins, they are the same as Holt's pins, but they are reorganized on his jacket to be orderly and all facing the right direction. For his gloves, I wanted to have the stripes going in horizontal on one hand and vertical on the other, just to sort of represent how he's sort of falling apart at the seams, trying to keep everything hidden in together. So here I'm just blocking out the colors on his scarf. For his lips, I wanted them to be the same sort of color as his bags, and also sort of a dark red to call back to one of the original movie posters. And you'll see here another big change that I made is I added some color blocking to the pants. I just felt like it added some more visual interest there in that area without actually adding anything that was too busy, because it is just color blocks. So I'm starting now on the shading, and overall from flats to finishing, this coloring process took me a little over an hour and a half, but I am just very relieved that I was able to sort of rework my sort of base redesign as I worked on it full scale and do something that I was happy with, because I didn't want Jackson's outfit to be too particularly astounding, but I also didn't want it to be as boring or as ordinary as Claude's per se. I wanted it to be unique but not experimental, if that makes any sense. So I'm doing a lot of warm shading to again really cement him in that color palette of the warm tones of the rainbow. I also have his headphones have a little pop of blue on them as a reference to the monster that he's trying to keep inside by wearing them all the time. I was really liking how these color blocks on his pants turned out, and on the trench coat as well, just because I feel like it adds a little bit more cohesion to the outfit with blocks of color in his outfit. I'm also glad that I was able to sort of get across, one, that he is hiding something through the visual language that I used of his outfit, but also that he is very much his own character. I feel like it definitely reads as kid who is nerdy and somehow simultaneously introverted and extroverted, I also am glad that it doesn't look too outrageous, especially next to Holt's upcoming redesign, but I also like that it's not so boring, because that was something that I wasn't super proud of, was Claude's redesign, because I felt like it looked a little bit boring, but at the same time I feel like that's his character. But that is very much not Jackson's character, and I really feel like there is a shortage of male fashion dolls that have actual fashion on them. Like, I feel like 95% of them is just hoodie, shorts, send it out. And so I definitely wanted to do some more with male fashion, being someone who designs mask fashion for myself all the time. So, just doing some final little bits on the color here. For the background, I used a photo of a medical library that was in the basement of a hospital. It was very fun exploring this. I think this picture is almost 6 years old now, but I think about it still. So glad I had it tucked away in my arsenal there. Then I'm just editing the color palette of it to make sure it matches everything, adding his little airbrushed silhouette there. And of course, I have to then go in and add all the little sparkle details, because I really feel like adding highlights really just pushes it to the final little finishing bit. And usually, this is where I would say, and here's the reveal, but that's going to wait, because actually, here is Holt's redesign. So, going on to Holt's redesign, I wanted to do something that was really just the complete opposite of what I did with Jackson. So I wanted to have there be a lot more sort of flowing, rounded shapes, whereas he is a bit more stretched out and has a bit taller body shape. I also wanted to use a lot more sheer fabrics and less coverage overall, just to sort of have him represent the opposite instead of trying to hide something. He's very open, and so I wanted to represent that visually as well. So starting out and just sketching out my body types here, from my inspiration mood board, I definitely wanted to go a lot more modern with his fashion and sort of contrast again Jackson's more vintage style. I also wanted to take some more inspiration from the monster aspects of the original, instead of having him be sort of like flame themed like he was in G1. I wanted to have him be more based off of the Jekyll monster seen throughout monster movie history. So here, starting out my first design, I've got some very big fluffy hair with a peplum jacket on the top and a blazer underneath to work as a shirt, as well as with some jean skirt and a pair of boots that match the same pair Jackson had. For the second look, I was a little bit more loose with it. I had him have some curly hair because I thought it'd be fun originally if they both had curly hair to sort of mix up with textures of the original, but I ended up going with straight hair for Jackson, again to simplify the design, and also because he's uptight. It seems like doing something to your hair is a bit more of a active choice than just assuming he has natural curly hair as well. I also have him wearing this big sort of lapelled sheer shirt over a tight fit turtleneck to again sort of fit in with those designs. For the third look, I went really loose with it, with a very long jacket and long flowing hair. For the fourth one, I wanted to incorporate the top hat, because I felt like, again, that's an iconic part of the silhouette, as well as with the cloak, so I had that tied around his waist to sort of break up the silhouette a little bit. And I also had flame jeans, but I felt, again, that was a little bit too close to the original, though I really see where they got it from, with the whole hot-headed nature of Hyde and all. And for the fifth and final look, I went sort of preppy with it, so he has this, very sculpted bob with a sheer cloak on top, a button-up underneath, and a button-up skirt as well. And then, at the bottom here, just as I did with Jackson, I'm going ahead and combining all my favorite ideas from those little sketches. So we've got a tight-fitting turtleneck, and over that, a sheer top with big lapels to mimic the silhouette of Jackson's trench coat, as well as Hyde's cloak tied around his waist to again mimic that same silhouette. And this time, the overtop and the cloak are, instead of being made of heavy, thick fabrics, are going to be sheer. So I'm just sketching out what I want his face to look like, as I wanted to get into his design to resemble more Hyde-like instead of a fire elemental. Then I'm going ahead and sketching out the colors. I wanted to really play around in that seafoam green sort of palette, blue, greens, little hints of yellow in there to reference Jackson, because again, that is what the 1940s, I think, posters had a lot of color symbolism with. Thing to note is that I wanted Jackson and Holt to have the same amount of layers overall, despite the differences in what they represent and the types of fabric used, but because I ended up redesigning or revising Jackson really a little bit later on, in the process, that does mean that technically Holt is wearing more layers than Jackson, so take that as you will. So I'm just sketching out all my dark greens here now to go on top of these seafoam greens to make sure I have some good contrast going on. I did end up thinking that his hair was a bit too similar in tone and shade to his skin, so I ended up changing that to a bit darker of a color later on. Include a little flame sort of embroidered patch on his sheared coat, because just as a little reference as to the original. I definitely like how this design turned out a lot more than I do Jackson's per se, at least his first design. I like it on the second revision, but I definitely felt like I had a lot more room to play around with in men's fashion and to just be having a lot more fun with fashion because it seems more in character with Holt. You'll also notice here I added a beret because I realized he was missing a hat and I wanted there to be something, and I felt like a small little beret on top didn't interrupt his silhouette too much, and also sort of keyed into how he's artsy, which is always a sort of overlooked aspect of his personality. So now moving on to the coloring. The total redesign time of Holt took 43 minutes, which was shorter than Jackson, but his coloring time took 1 hour and 41 minutes, which was longer than Jackson, so in the end they ended up being almost exactly the same time. So, as you'll see, here's that darker blue hair color I was talking about because I wanted to increase the contrast, and you'll also notice that he has some little glasses because I always thought it was a little bit stupid that Jackson had to wear glasses and Holt didn't. And I know why they cut it from the design. It's because visually, if you wear glasses, you're a nerd, obviously. But I definitely wanted to add glasses and have them be tinted to sort of match up all the different sheer fabric elements in Holt's outfit. The belt, we'll call it, of his cloak tied around his waist in a little rose shape just because I thought it added some interest. It's fun, it's fruity. His boots here are the exact same as Jackson's, but a different color as mentioned earlier, so I'm just going through and coloring those. I also wanted to add some little hints of bright green throughout, just like there is in Jackson's palette, because again, they are the same, and I definitely wanted to have a lot of visual cohesion between the two designs, but at the same time, a lot of the same elements are used to say something completely different visually, so that was fun. Sort of mimic the color blocking of Jackson's design, I'm adding a lot of sort of details on these small blocks of solid color on Holt. So his socks here are going to be striped in opposite directions to match Jackson's gloves, but in a different location. And on his collar, I also have some lining around the edges and the same on the lapels of his peplum leather jacket. I'm also having him wear the same sort of gloves as Jackson, but with holes taken out of the tops and the fingers cut off to show off his claws, and also because, again, it is symbolic of the fact that he's more open. So here I'm just messing with the blue. I decided to do different amounts of sheerness for different colors to sort of have everything balance out nicely instead of having it all be on one layer. I also gave him a chain necklace because I wanted him to sort of seem, again, very modern, very TikTok boy. For his leggings, I just used a Creative Commons image of some very fine knit mesh, so that way it has that same texture while not being too different of a color from his own skin tone. For the glasses, I'm adding a hue to them, unlike Jackson's, which were clear, because I felt like that, again, just sort of tied in with all of his sheer theming a little bit better. Now I'm just coloring in his headphones, which he has to wear all the time for music, and I think that AirPods are such an easy way out because I love drawing wires. So you'll see here I'm just coloring all these little buttons he's got all over now. He's got a button-up sheer top, he's got buttons on the cuffs, he's got decorative buttons on the lapels, buttons on the skirt. A lot of buttons going on. I just think they're fun to draw, and I like coming up with all the different little details for them. So we've just got some reversal stripes and an anarchy symbol in there, as well as some pride patches. Now on his phone case, I wanted to put a little Gemini symbol, even though it's mostly obscured by his hand, that's what it is. Overall, I really like how his design ended up coming together. I feel like it reads as artsy and preppy, and yet at the same time alternative and sort of subverting the sort of standards that Jackson upholds in his look. With the loose socks, cloak around the waist, lots of sheer fabrics. Probably not school approved, but on the technicality it is covering his shoulders. So here I'm just doing a lot of shading. Again, I'm shading in cool colors here to sort of contrast. I shaded in warm colors with Jackson. definitely shading is one of my favorite parts, and it always goes a lot faster than I think it's going to. These leggings were kind of giving me some trouble. I felt like they weren't reading super well as too different from a skin tone, so I was futzing around with them, so I'm in the final parts here. For a skirt, I wanted to use a plaid texture to sort of, again, make it look a little bit visually more preppy than otherwise might be expected out of a Hyde character. I didn't want him to necessarily be someone who hates going to school and breaks all the rules all the time just because, but imagine him as more someone who has something very specific that he's trying to hide, that being Holt's gender nonconformity and just sort of like being loud and extroverted and creative instead of harsh and analytical and closed off the way Jackson is. I wanted to also sort of shade the edging of the sheer cloak in the same highlight texture and color scheme as the jacket because I imagine it sort of pleathered the edges on it. The thing I'm probably most proud about this design is definitely I feel like it got a successful degree away from existing designs that either are canon or non-canon that I've seen in the past. I definitely feel like I was able to sort of do my own spin on things, which is always what I'm striving to do here. So I'm just finishing up the shading here on the cloak and all the sheer fabrics, which was interesting to try to figure out how to shade to not make it look like it's solid fabric, but sheer instead. So just adding some final shading and highlights to the hair here, bringing in some more sort of highlights. I definitely wanted the streaks to match up with Jackson, so they're in the same location, but instead of being white, they're sort of like a light aqua, so that it matches the equally changed color of his base hair. Another little small detail to sort of set Jekyll and Holt apart is that I drew Holt's shoelaces as being untied and different lengths, which I imagine Jackson would never do. So now I'm just fitzing with the last bits of levels here, trying to brighten up the shoes because I felt like there was a little bit too much darkness on the bottom half of this image as compared to the top half. For the background image, I used a picture of a Halloween bingo night that my college put on a couple years ago because that's the closest that I've ever been to a party. So I figured the neon lights and the dark atmosphere were close enough here. I was also going to add a matching sort of glowing background because it was really needed in this case since the background I chose is so dark. Then I'm just going in, doing my last little bits of sparkle highlights, and now it is finally time for the reveals, plural. So first up we have Jackson. I'm really happy with how this overall design turned out. Definitely took a while for me to really figure out what I wanted to do with this one, but I really do like where it ended up with all of the bright yellow and orange color palette and color blocking throughout the outfit. I just really like how it ended up coming out, even if it took a second draft. For Holt, his design didn't change much from sketch to finish, and I really love it. I really had a lot of fun with this design. I love playing around with men's fashion and mask fashion in general, and I definitely love that I was able to do a lot of different things with this one that all comes together for a cohesive, layered outfit. So, moving on to the comparisons between generations now. I feel like Jackson looks fairly similar in vibes to his Generation 1, and Holt is very different, which is great, because that's what I really wanted to go for, because I remember when Holt first came out, everyone was confused, why is the Hyde monster, flame-themed? So I wanted to sort of change that. And then finally, I have the lineup of all the redesigns I've done so far. I love seeing them all put together. I have Jackson and Holt, both being pretty short. Holt a little bit taller than Jackson, but ultimately them both being pretty short because, they're technically human rather than full-blown monster per se. So that was the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed. Up next will be a Venus redesign, which I'm very excited about. But before that, in February, I have something very special and very big planned, and in March, I have a little regular speed paint, no talking video. So be sure to keep an eye out in April for that Venus redesign, and also be sure to follow me either my Twitter or my Instagram for art posted at least 4 times a month, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!